The chandelier flickered as if it hesitated to illuminate what should never have been revealed. She walked in no invitation, no entourage, no gown stitched by silent tailors. Just her. Sand-colored dress clinging to skin weathered by life, shoes worn at the soles, posture neither apologetic nor proud. Heads turned not because they recognized her, but because they didn't. The entire banquet hall, gilded and polished for the Castel family's annual foundation gala, seemed to freeze. And then, in the silence, she opened the letter. She didn't read it aloud. She simply unfolded the paper, held it up, and looked at the man at the head table, Vincent Castel, Silver Temple tycoon, celebrated patron, adored by the elite, and feared by the press. A breath escaped her lips, barely louder than a whisper. "Tell them, Vincent." He blinked. That was all. But in that blink was decades of denial, a history scrubbed clean by money, shame, and carefully burned evidence. She said no more. She didn't have to. Because the letter signed, dated, and yellowed at the edges had his name. And hers. And one more, written in the uneven scrawl of a dying woman. Our child, no one knew her name. Not the guests, not the caterers, not even the guards who had assumed she was lost and let her in out of pity. But Mariah knew this building better than they did. She'd cleaned it once. Polished those same marble floors where now her dust-covered shoes stood defiantly. Wiped the edges of that chandelier before her mother's hands started trembling. Back when her mother still whispered in her sleep, "He should have known you," Mariah had never understood those words. Until 2 weeks ago. It began with a phone call from a hospital she hadn't expected to hear from. A woman named Celia Moore, her mother's former nurse, had held something for years, a letter, kept sealed as instructed. "She told me to give this to you after she passed," Celia had said. "I couldn't find you before, but I do now," and just like that, everything she believed about herself unraveled. Mariah wasn't just the daughter of a quiet woman who worked as a seamstress and cleaned up her floor mansions to pay for school shoes and grocery staples. She was the child of a lie, conceived in silence, hidden from the world, and denied. Her father, Vincent Castel, had written a check once. Just one. Long before she was born. The letter said as much. "To ensure this doesn't affect either of our lives," he had written, offering a cruel kind of closure. No child. No scandal. No trace, but there was a child. A daughter. And there were traces. Letters. Photos. A worn pendant with the initials Emke Mariah Castel that her mother had tucked into a pillow, as if the world might one day give her daughter what she could not, a name that meant something. Now she stood in front of the rich, the dressed, the sculpted and powdered, holding not vengeance but proof. "I don't want your money," she said, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm. She did not cry. "I don't need your name." But I won't let her die erased. There was a tremor in Vincent's hand as he reached for his glass. But he didn't drink. Couldn't. His son, Matthew Castel, stood up, face pale, jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "Security. Get her out of here." But no one moved. Not yet. Because something in Mariah's presence, something unshakably honest, held the room in place. She didn't look like someone who had come for spectacle. She looked like someone who had waited her whole life to be allowed to speak. "I have letters," she continued. "Photos. DNA results. Her will. Everything your father tried to bury. She left it all for me. And I've made copies. They're with lawyers. With journalists. With people who don't answer to you." And with that, the illusion cracked. It wasn't just the guests who stared. It was the waitstaff, the musicians, the photographers. People from every corner of the room watched as a woman no one knew became unforgettable. Vincent rose slowly. He didn't deny it. Couldn't. The words hung in the air between them like the last breath of someone dying. I didn't know, he said, but the words fell thin. She told me she said she didn't want anything. Mariah blinked, lips tight. She wanted acknowledgement, she replied. But when she realized you wouldn't give her that, she gave it to me. Quietly. In the ways she could. There was a long pause before she added, you erased her. But she wrote me back into the world. No applause. No shouting. Just stillness. As if the entire room suddenly realized the story wasn't about them anymore. It never had been. Outside, the city remained indifferent. Cars passed. Horns honked. The skyline shimmered above shadows and scaffolding. But inside that ballroom, everything had shifted. Not because a woman claimed an inheritance, but because she didn't. She didn't ask for money or power. She asked for truth. And for once, the truth spoke louder than the fortune it had threatened to ruin. Mariah didn't wait to be escorted out. She folded the letter back into its envelope, turned, and began to walk away. Her steps echoed softly through the marble hall, as if even the floor wanted to remember the rhythm of her defiance. The guards, confused, half waiting for orders, let her pass. No one stopped her, but not everyone stayed silent. A voice older, trembling but clear, cut through the murmuring crowd. Wait, it was Eleanor Castel, Vincent's wife. She stood with the grace of a woman raised in luxury, but something in her face, perhaps a crack in the decades-old porcelain mask, suggested that she had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Her eyes followed Mariah like someone recognizing a ghost from long ago. I saw the pendant once, Eleanor said, her voice audible, now across the room. In a drawer. Years ago. I thought it was. Some mistake. Mariah turned. She didn't speak. Eleanor took a slow breath, steadying her fingers around a glass she didn't drink from. You look like her. But your eyes. They're his. There was a hush. It wasn't confirmation, not exactly. But it was more than denial. And in a room ruled by appearances, even that small confession shattered the air like glass. Vincent sat down heavily, as though his legs could no longer bear the weight of a past that had finally become present. Outside the hall, Mariah exhaled for the first time in hours. The night air wrapped around her, sharp and clean. She hadn't thought beyond this moment. She hadn't imagined what it would feel like, not revenge, not triumph. Just release. The truth was no longer hers alone. It had been handed over, like a lit candle in a room full of shadows. She walked down the steps slowly, each movement shedding years of silence. She thought of her mother not in her final days, when the hospital bed had replaced the old sofa, but before that. Sitting in the kitchen humming softly as she cooked, folding laundry with fingers that still stitched seams for the rich, making magic out of nothing. She thought of how her mother had always paused when the Castel name was mentioned on TV. A flicker in her eyes. A silence. Mariah had assumed it was jealousy or anger. But now she knew it was grief. Grief that had to remain hidden. 3 days passed. Mariah didn't expect anything to change. The world rarely moved for women like her, black, poor, invisible. Especially not when power had long been defined by absence. The absence of acknowledgement, of apology, of responsibility. But then, something did change. It began with a letter. Hand-delivered. Heavy cream paper, wax-sealed, the kind used for weddings or funerals or family secrets, long overdue. She opened it carefully. The signature at the bottom read, Eleanor Castel. It was short. Just a few lines. You deserve more than silence. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. The garden behind the chapel. Come alone, if you're willing. No promises. No threats. Just a window. Mariah considered throwing it away. But curiosity had its own gravity, and something in her mother's memory urged her forward. The garden was quiet, overgrown, but elegant. Ivy climbed the stone walls as if trying to soften them. The chapel loomed behind like a silent witness. Eleanor was already there, seated on an iron bench beneath a tree shedding pale blossoms. She looked different in daylight. Less regal. More real. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure either, Mariah replied. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that stretches between generations. I loved him once, Eleanor said. Before the money became the only language he spoke. Before he started measuring worth in last names and bank accounts, Mariah listened. I stayed because I had a role. A name. A family to keep intact. Even if it was built on omissions, her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of years unlived. But I never imagined that he would leave a daughter behind. Mariah looked at her, unflinching. He didn't leave me. He never came for me. That's different. Eleanor nodded, accepting the truth. I saw your mother once, she confessed. At a gallery opening decades ago. She was standing by a painting, smiling like she belonged there. Vincent noticed her too. I should have understood what that meant. A breeze swept through the garden. The blossoms trembled. I can't undo what he did, Eleanor continued. But I can give you this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. Inside was the pendant, Mariah's pendant. The one her mother had kept hidden, pressed beneath old pillowcases and fading memories. But this one was polished, preserved. It gleamed faintly in the light. I found it in his drawer. He kept it. All this time. I think. He wanted to remember, even if he pretended not to. Mariah took the box, her hand steady. She didn't thank her, not yet. She just held it. There's a room in the foundation. The archive, Eleanor added. Photos, records. Things most people never see. If you want to look, I'll open it for you. You deserve to see where you came from. All of it, Mariah returned that evening. The archive was quiet. Rows of binders, boxes, dusty ledgers. She traced her fingers along spines of books older than her. Eleanor had given her a key and left her alone. She opened a drawer marked 1993. Inside were documents. Letters. A black and white photo. It was her mother. Pregnant. Alone. Standing on a dock near a lake, one hand resting on her belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. On the back, a note in Vincent's handwriting. I told myself this would disappear. But some things don't. Mariah sat down, the photo in her lap. She didn't cry. She simply existed fully, finally inside a truth that had tried to erase her. Mariah didn't leave the archive for hours. She moved through drawers and boxes like a quiet archaeologist, unearthing not artifacts, but absences. Every document, every scribbled margin note, every photograph where her mother appeared in the corner of the frame half lit, half cropped was proof, not only of her existence, but of the effort to contain it. Her life had been footnoted in someone else's narrative, confined to margins where no one was supposed to look. She saw it all. A canceled check from 1992. A torn envelope addressed to M. L. Moore, a note that read, "Tell her to stay away," no signature. But there were softer things too. A birthday card never sent. A fabric swatch that matched the dress her mother wore in a photo she had at home. And at the very bottom of one box, tucked beneath a pile of unrelated paperwork, a small Polaroid, her as a baby, on her mother's lap. A man's hand reaching in from the side. Not quite in the frame, but unmistakably his Vincent's watch still visible on the wrist. Proof again. Irrefutable. She didn't take any of it. She simply photographed it all. Quietly. Gently. As if disturbing it too much would dishonor the silence it had survived in. She walked out into the night with a strange calm in her chest. Not closure, that word was too final, but clarity. Something had been hidden from her for so long that she'd started believing it wasn't real. And now, in this fragile quiet, it was. She no longer had to beg for space inside a story that was always hers. The next morning, a headline appeared just beneath the digital fold, but high enough to be seen. Daughter of Vincent Castle breaks silence. I don't want his money. I want my mother seen. There was no scandalous photo. No sensational twist. Just a picture of Mariah standing in the garden outside the chapel, holding the pendant in her hand. The article quoted her directly. It told the truth plainly. The journalist had received the package. She'd sent copies of everything. Letters. DNA results. Her mother's will. Every document meticulously scanned and catalogued. And then an unexpected ripple. Messages poured in. From people who had known her mother. From former staff. From others who had worked for the Castle family and seen what no one was allowed to speak of. She was kind. Quiet. Always stayed late. She once gave me her lunch when I forgot mine. I remember her humming while cleaning the stairwell. I never knew she was carrying his child. One letter stood out, handwritten in elegant cursive. No name. Just initials. J.E. I was a friend of your mother's. She didn't speak of him often, but when she did, it was never with bitterness. Only sorrow. She believed in dignity more than justice. But I believe you gave her both. Mariah read it twice. Then she cried. For the first time since all of it began. Not because she was broken, but because something inside her was finally being seen. A week later, an announcement came from the Castle Foundation. In acknowledgement of truths long buried, the foundation is renaming its Women's Scholarship Initiative in honor of Margaret L. Moore. Her resilience, grace, and strength represent the values we strive to uphold. We were blind to her story. We will not be blind again. Mariah didn't attend the press event. She didn't need to. She sat instead by the lake where the photo of her mother had been taken, her hands resting in her lap just like hers had done decades earlier. In her pocket, the pendant. Around her wrist, her mother's scarf. She looked at her reflection in the water, how it swayed gently with the wind, soft and undefined, but still there. Still hers. Then came the final letter, delivered by courier. Thin envelope. No logo. Inside was a page of cream paper and a signature that shook her. Vincent Castle. The handwriting was unsteady. Fragile. Perhaps it had taken him the entire week to find the words. Perhaps he hadn't written anything heartfelt in decades. Mariah, I was wrong. There is no dignity in silence when it protects only power. I thought I could outlive the truth, but the truth has outlived me. I don't know what I can offer you now, except to say I see her in you. Not just your face, your presence, your calm, your refusal to scream when silence says more. I've made arrangements. They'll be explained to you soon. I'm sorry. Vincent, no legal jargon, no terms, just words. But words, when spoken at last, can be more valuable than wealth. A month later, The will was read. There was silence in the room when her name appeared, not as a footnote, not as a mistake, but as heir. Maria Castell, daughter. She wasn't given everything. That was never her desire. But she was given enough. Enough to choose where to live, how to work, how to honor her mother's name without begging for recognition. The others contested, of course. Lawyers stirred. Siblings muttered about manipulation and ambush, but the documentation was too complete. The evidence too strong. The law, for once, had no room to bend. And Maria didn't fight them. She didn't need to. She simply walked into the foundation one last time, stood at the podium during a closed meeting, and said, "I was never here to take what's yours. I came to reclaim what was mine all along my history, my mother's truth, her dignity, her memory." Then she stepped down. After the will was settled, after the last photographer lost interest, and the final headlines blurred into digital archives, Maria disappeared from public view. Not because she was hiding, but because she no longer had anything to prove. She chose not the grandest estate, nor the accounts filled with old world stocks and luxury shares. What she took, what she wanted, was the house her mother once passed by on the way to clean someone else's. A modest place just on the edge of the city, with cracked steps and a wide porch that looked west into the afternoon sun. It wasn't a mansion. It was hers. She filled it not with designer furniture, but with memories. She hung the Polaroid of her mother in the hallway. She framed the pendant in a shadow box and placed it above her desk. She filled the rooms with the kind of silence that doesn't come from being ignored, but from being at peace. Some days, she would sit near the window and write pages meant only for herself. Fragments of her mother's life. Pieces of what had been denied. Not to publish. Not to expose. But to remember. She wrote her name in full, Margaret Lillian Moore. Over and over, like a prayer. As if each time the ink dried, the world whispered back, "I see her now." One afternoon, a letter came. Hand-addressed. No seal. No emblem. It was from Matthew Castell Vincent's son, her half-brother by blood, but little else. The envelope was creased. The handwriting sharp. You should have stayed gone. You think you won something, but all you did was ruin everything. He was our father. Not yours, she read it once. Then again. And then, carefully, she set it down. She didn't reply, because she knew something Matthew never would. She hadn't come to win. She had come to restore. And restoration doesn't require permission. 2 weeks later, Eleanor Castell arrived at her door without warning. No security, no chauffeur. Just a woman in her late 60s, dressed in neutral tones, holding a canvas bag. Maria welcomed her in. They sat in silence for a while, tea between them. Time had softened Eleanor's posture, but not her presence. Her voice, when she finally spoke, held weight. "I don't know if you believe me," she said, "but I've thought of her often. And now I think of you." Maria nodded. "I believe you think of her." "I don't know what else I believe yet. That's fair." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was dated 1991. A gala. Eleanor in a silver dress. Vincent by her side. And just behind them, almost out of frame, a young woman in a dark green uniform barely noticeable, but unmistakably her mother. She was at the door that night, Eleanor said softly. I remember asking her to help with the flowers. I didn't know then. Or maybe I did, but chose not to. Maria stared at the photo. She was always almost in the picture, she whispered, but never allowed to be in focus. I think, Eleanor said slowly, That's why the world is changing. Because people like you are refusing to stay in the blur. It wasn't an apology. It was something more complicated. A reckoning. Together, they created something new. Not a press campaign. Not a charity. A space. A physical living archive called The Second Frame, a place for the invisible stories of women who raised cities in silence, who folded shirts and swallowed grief, who loved quietly and were never named. Mariah opened it inside the foundation, but on her terms. The first exhibit featured her mother's life, not just her connection to the Castel family, but her sewing, her letters, her music, her recipes, her stories. She curated every detail like a daughter building a cathedral out of memory. Visitors came, quietly at first, then more. Some left notes. Some brought photos. Some stood in front of the glass where the pendant was displayed and wept without saying why. Mariah stood in the back of the room most days, observing. It was never about her. It was always about returning what had been taken. One morning, a girl no older than 12 approached her. Was she your mom? The girl asked, pointing at a black and white photo. Yes, Mariah replied gently. She looked strong. She was. The girl hesitated. Is that why you made this place? Mariah smiled. No, I made this place because no one else did. The girl nodded, as if that made perfect sense. I think she'd be proud. Mariah felt something shift in her chest like an ache dissolving. I hope so, she said. But what she meant was, I know so. Weeks turned into months. The Castel name changed, not erased, but complicated. No longer polished marble. Now marked with human flaws, with confession, with consequence. Some resented it. Others respected it more. Mariah kept her name, not for pride, but for presence. She used more when she taught writing workshops at the community center. She used Castel when the foundation asked for her approval. But most of the time, she used neither. She signed simply, Mariah, as if that, finally, was enough. And it was. Because when your name is no longer hidden, no longer denied, it doesn't need embellishment. It just needs to be spoken. With respect. Winter came softly that year, as if the world itself understood it was time to be gentle. The old trees behind the second frame lost their leaves in silence, one by one, like pages falling from a finished story. Inside, the lighting was warm, golden even, and the scent of wood polish lingered near the exhibits. Visitors still came, though fewer now. But those who did came for something deeper than curiosity. They came to feel seen. Mariah had built a home not just for her mother's memory, but for everyone who had been erased with polite smiles and locked drawers. Women whose hands raised children, not their own. Fathers who were denied. Siblings who bore shame not born of guilt, but of being inconvenient. She had opened a door no one else dared to, and she had stood there. Still, quiet, unshaken. Vincent Castel passed away in January. There was no scandal, no second obituary. Just a solemn announcement in the papers. A legacy mixed in its accounts. Wealth, yes, but also silence. And at the very end, truth. Mariah did not attend the funeral. She sent flowers. White gardenias, her mother's favorite. And a card with 4 words handwritten in her even script. She told me everything. She didn't sign it. She didn't need to. Some truths no longer require introduction. A few days after his burial, Eleanor came to see her. No makeup. No driver. She looked tired, but not broken. He left something for you, she said, placing a small velvet pouch on the table. Mariah hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a key and a note, the lake house. Yours now. I was wrong to keep it hidden. She remembered the photo. Her mother standing there, pregnant, on that wooden dock. The lake behind her calm and endless. For a moment, Maria couldn't breathe. Not from grief, but from the full, quiet weight of something being returned. Not money, not apologies, but space. Space to exist where she had once been erased. She visited it in the spring. It was untouched quiet, frozen in time. The walls held echoes. The dock creaked beneath her steps. Inside, a few belongings remained. An old fishing rod, a dusty photo album, a box of unmailed letters, never opened. She stayed for hours. Didn't touch much. But as she stood on the dock, eyes scanning the horizon, she could almost feel her mother's hand on her back. Guiding, steadying, saying nothing, just being there. Maria closed her eyes. And in that stillness, she felt it. The circle had closed. Not in vengeance, not in fury, but in fullness. The months that followed were calm. She continued her work, slowly expanding the archive. She was invited to speak at universities, asked to write, but she said no to most of it. She wasn't building a platform. She was cultivating memory, and dignity, and legacy. One woman found her after a gallery talk and wept in her arms. My mother was a maid too, she whispered. She died before anyone knew her name. Thank you for building a place where she belongs. Maria said nothing, just held her. Because sometimes healing isn't loud. It's shared. On the 1-year anniversary of her mother's birthday, Maria hosted a small gathering at the second frame. No cameras, no press, just stories. A musician played one of her mother's favorite songs alow, humming jazz melody from an old record player. People shared memories, some joyful, others raw. And at the end, Maria read from her mother's journal. Just a few lines. Words her mother had written in the quiet hours after cleaning mansions filled with other people's dreams. I don't want her to hate them. I just want her to be more than they ever imagined she could be. Maria closed the notebook, looked out at the room, and for a moment, the past and present stood side by side. Her mother's voice, her legacy, her truth, none of it had disappeared. It had been planted, and now it had grown. She never used the lake house for show, but she visited it often. And once a year, she stayed the full week of her mother's birthday. She would bring fresh flowers, bake bread with a recipe passed down in smudged ink. And she would sit on the dock as the sky folded itself into dusk, pendant around her neck, her mother's scarf tied gently to her wrist. And one evening, on that very dock, a young girl appeared. She was maybe 16, nervous, holding a letter. Maria stood slowly. "You're welcome here," she said. The girl nodded, her voice barely audible. "I think I might be like you." Maria took the letter. "Read it." Another story. Another mother. Another truth buried under shame and time. She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "Then let's make sure you're never forgotten." And so the story went on. Not just hers, but all of theirs. The lost, the hidden, the denied. The ones who dared to reclaim their names without anger. Who sought not destruction, but recognition. And in quiet rooms filled with old photos and whispered songs, those names echoed louder than any legacy built on silence. Because in the end, justice doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing still, holding a photo, telling the truth, and not needing to be asked twice.